The spotlight beam cut through the darkness at 0247 hours, and what it found staring back at Captain Ray Novak was not a seal. It was pale, almost luminescent against the black water, with a face that held features too human to dismiss and too wrong to accept. Dark hair clung to its head and shoulders like wet rope, like kelp torn from the seafloor. Its eyes caught the light and gave nothing back to pools of oil-slick darkness. It seemed to absorb the beam rather than reflect it. And in its hands, clearly visible in that frozen moment, was the edge of his purse seine, held taut while something sharp drew across the mesh. It was cutting his net, systematically, deliberately. But here is what Ray Novak still cannot explain, what keeps him awake at night more than 2 decades later. When that light hit the creature's face, when their eyes met across 40 feet of Alaskan water, it did not flee. It did not dive. It looked directly at him, held his gaze for a long moment, and then simply returned to its work. It was not afraid of him at all. But to understand what Ray Novak encountered that night in the summer of 2002, and what his cameras would later capture, we need to go back to the beginning of that salmon season, when the biggest sockeye run in the world was about to deliver something far stranger than fish. Bristol Bay, Alaska, represents one of the last great wild fisheries on Earth. Each summer, tens of millions of sockeye salmon return to these waters, fighting their way up the Nushagak, the Kivichek, the Nanik, and a dozen other rivers to spawn in the same gravel beds where they were born. The commercial fleet that pursues them is a tight community. Several hundred boats working waters their families have fished for generations. These are men and women who understand the sea in ways that cannot be taught, who read the water and the weather with an instinct born of decades on the deck, who trust each other's word because their lives depend on it. Ray Novak had been part of that fleet for 31 years by the summer of 2002. His vessel, the Bristol Maid, was a 32-foot aluminum seiner that he had purchased in 1987 and maintained with the kind of obsessive care that only fishermen understand. She was not the biggest boat in the fleet, nor the newest, but she was paid off, and she was his. And in good years, she put his kids through college and kept the lights on during the long Alaskan winters. Ray was 54 years old that summer, with a face weathered by 3 decades of salt spray and a reputation for being one of the most methodical skippers in the Dillingham fleet. He did not drink to excess, he did not take unnecessary risks, and he did not tell stories. This last quality would become significant in the weeks that followed. His crew that season consisted of 2 men he trusted absolutely. His brother-in-law, Mike Peterson, had fished with him for 19 years and served as deck boss, handling the net and the hydraulics with an efficiency born of long practice. Mike was a quiet man, heavyset and strong, who had seen everything these waters could throw at a vessel and had never once lost his composure. The third member of their crew was Danny Okonek, a 22-year-old from Anchorage who was working his 4th season on the Bristol Maid to pay his way through engineering school at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Danny approached the work with the analytical mind of his studies, always asking how things worked, always looking for ways to improve their efficiency. These 3 men would share an experience that summer that none of them have ever fully reconciled, and that only Ray has ever spoken about publicly. What the others saw, what they believe, remains their own secret. But Ray Novak decided long ago that someone needed to tell this story. The season opened on June 24th, and by all accounts, the first week proceeded normally. The fish were coming in strong, thick schools of sockeye that turned the water dark with their passage, and the Bristol Maid was filling her holds at a pace that promised a profitable year. The weather held fair, the equipment functioned as it should, and the crew fell into the comfortable rhythm of men who had worked together long enough to anticipate each other's movements. But when they pulled their nets on the morning of July 2nd, Ray noticed something that would mark the beginning of everything that followed. There was a cut in the mesh. Not a tear, not a hole worn through by use or snagged on debris, not the ragged damage left by a seal or sea lion, trying to steal a meal. A cut, clean and straight, perhaps 18 inches long, slicing through the monofilament with surgical precision. Ray examined it carefully, running his fingers along the severed strands, holding the damaged section up to the morning light. The edges were too clean, too deliberate. This was not natural wear. This was not predator damage. This was something else entirely. Probably caught a piece of metal, Mike said when Ray showed him the damage. Old cable, maybe, or a piece of someone's lost gear drifting through. Ray nodded, because that explanation made sense. Because it was the kind of thing that happens sometimes in waters where men had been fishing for a century. They patched the net and returned to work, and by noon, the incident was forgotten. But the next morning, there was another cut, and the morning after that, 2 more. By the end of the first week of July, the Bristol maid had sustained 7 separate incisions in her purse seam, each one clean and straight, each one appearing in roughly the same section of net, each one discovered only after the night's set had been retrieved. Something was damaging his gear. Something was costing him fish. And there was something else that Ray noticed, something he did not mention to his crew at first, because he was not certain what to make of it. The cuts were not random. They appeared in the belly of the net, near the bottom where the fish would collect during the drift, and they were just large enough to allow a sockeye salmon to pass through. Not large enough for a seal, not placed where a seal would attack, but perfectly sized and positioned to release the catch. Something was slicing open his nets and taking his fish, not tearing them in a frenzy of predation, not biting through in a struggle for food, but cutting them with purpose, harvesting them. The rational explanations came easily at first, as rational explanations always do. Seals were the obvious culprit, though Ray had never known a seal to cut netting rather than simply tear through it. Their teeth were designed for gripping fish, not slicing monofilament. Sea lions were a possibility, though their damage was typically more violent, more chaotic, the result of powerful animals forcing their way through mesh to reach the catch inside. These cuts showed none of that violence. Some of the other skippers, when Ray mentioned the damage during radio conversations, suggested sabotage. Perhaps a competing vessel was trying to reduce his catch, slipping a diver into the water during the night sets to cripple his gear. But that theory fell apart upon examination. The cuts were appearing in the middle of the night, during Ray's sets, in waters where no other vessel was operating. And what saboteur would use such a small, precise incision? If someone wanted to ruin his nets, they would slash them from top to bottom, not make careful cuts that could be easily patched. Danny, who approached most problems with an engineer's logic, suggested that perhaps some new species of large fish was responsible, something with a sharp dorsal spine or a bony ridge that could slice through monofilament as it struggled against the mesh. A lancet fish, perhaps, or some deep water species driven to the surface by changing currents. But what kind of fish would cut the same section of net, night after night, with such consistent precision? And what would it do with the salmon that escaped through those cuts? Fish did not harvest. Fish did not plan. Fish did not return to the same spot each night to continue their work. Whatever it is, Mike said on the evening of July 8th, as they examined yet another incision in the mesh, "It's costing us money." He was right about that. Ray estimated they had lost somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds of sockeye to those mysterious cuts. Fish that should have been in their holds and were instead gone into the dark water. At Bristol Bay prices, that represented several $1,000s, money that would have gone toward the winter's bills, toward maintenance on the Bristol Maid, toward the futures his crew was working to build. But more than the money, it was the mystery that gnawed at Ray Novak. He had spent his entire adult life on these waters, had seen every kind of damage and disaster and strange occurrence that the sea could produce, and he could not explain what was happening to his nets. That night, he made a decision that would change his life. He would keep watch. The Bristol Maid carried a 1,000,000 candle power spotlight mounted on her wheelhouse. a piece of equipment used primarily for navigation in fog and for locating markers in the darkness. Ray positioned himself on deck with his hand on that spotlight, wrapped in a heavy jacket against the Alaskan night, while Mike and Danny slept below. The net was set in the usual location, a proven drift about 2 miles offshore from Dillingham, in waters Ray had fished for 3 decades. The night was calm, the water black and still, the sky above thick with stars that cast just enough light to see the outline of the distant shore. For several hours, Ray saw nothing but the gentle rise and fall of his cork line marking the edge of the net. The cold seeped into his bones. His eyes grew heavy, and he was beginning to think that perhaps tonight would be different, that whatever was damaging his nets had moved on to other waters. When at 0215 hours, he noticed the corks moving. Not the rhythmic bobbing of fish hitting the mesh, the familiar pulse that told him the catch was accumulating. This was different. A concentrated disturbance, a section of the cork line dipping and swaying in a pattern that suggested something larger, something moving with purpose along the length of the net. Ray raised the spotlight, but did not yet turn it on. He watched the disturbance travel slowly along the net, moving from west to east, pausing occasionally as if whatever was causing it was examining the mesh or working at something beneath the surface. His heart was beating very fast now, though he could not have said exactly why. There was nothing overtly threatening about what he was seeing, nothing that should have produced the cold weight of dread that was settling into his chest. But 31 years on the water had given Ray Novak instincts that went beyond conscious thought, and those instincts were telling him that something was very wrong. This was not a seal. This was not debris. This was something else. At 0247, he switched on the spotlight. The beam cut through the darkness like a blade, illuminating a circle of water, perhaps 60 feet in diameter, turning the black surface into something visible, something knowable. What the beam revealed in that first instant has been seared into Ray Novak's memory for more than 20 years, and his description has never wavered in any detail, not through countless retellings, not through all the skepticism and mockery and quiet pity that followed. There was a figure in the water beside his net. It was humanoid in form, with a head and torso that rose perhaps 2 feet above the surface. Its skin was pale, not the pink-white of human flesh, but something grayer, corpse-colored, something that looked like it had never seen sunlight, like the belly of a deep-water fish brought up from the abyss, gray-white and smooth, with a faint pattern of scales visible on what might have been its shoulders and the sides of its face. Its hair was dark and tangled, hanging in wet ropes around features that Ray's mind struggled to process. The hair clung to its head and shoulders like seaweed, like something that belonged in the water rather than on it. The eyes were too large and too dark, black pools without visible whites or irises, reflecting no light despite the million candle power beam hitting them directly. The mouth, which opened slightly as the light hit it, revealed teeth that were wrong too many, too sharp, needle-thin and arranged in multiple rows like the inside of a shark's jaw. And the body, what he could see of it below the waterline through the clear Alaskan water, did not end in legs. There was a tail, silver gray and scaled, powerful enough that its idle movement was creating the disturbance he had observed in the cork line. The tail ended in ragged fins that caught the light with an iridescent shimmer before disappearing into the darkness below. In its hands that were webbed, that ended in fingers too long and too thin, that curved into claws rather than nails, it held his net. One hand gripped the mesh, while the other held something that glinted in the spotlight beam, something that Ray first took for a knife, but would later describe as more like a claw, or perhaps a piece of shell, curved and sharp. It was cutting his net, and it was looking at him. For a long moment, perhaps 5 seconds that felt like an hour, they simply stared at each other across 40 feet of black Alaskan water. Ray Novak, 54 years old, veteran of 3 decades on these seas, and whatever this thing was that should not exist, that could not exist, that was nonetheless undeniably there. He would later say that what struck him most was the absence of fear in its expression. It did not startle when the light hit it, did not dive or flee or show any sign of alarm. It simply looked at him with those oil-dark eyes, and in that look was something that Ray has struggled to articulate ever since. Recognition, perhaps. Assessment. A weighing and measuring that found him unimportant. The way a person might glance at an insect that had landed nearby, acknowledge its presence, and then continue with their work. And then, while Ray stood frozen with his hand on the spotlight, that is exactly what the creature did. It turned its attention back to the net and continued its work. It finished cutting a section of mesh, approximately 18 inches, the same size as all the other cuts they had discovered. Through the opening, Ray saw fish escaping, dark shapes slipping through into the water beyond. And then the creature gathered several of the escaping salmon in its arms, in motion so casual, so practiced, that it spoke of long experience and dove. The movement was fluid, almost graceful, the silver tail breaking the surface for just a moment before disappearing into the black water. It was not fleeing. It was simply leaving, having completed whatever task had brought it to his nets that night. Ray Novak stood on the deck of the Bristol Maid until dawn, the spotlight gripped in hands that would not stop shaking, waiting for it to return. It did not. When Mike and Danny emerged at first light, they found their captain gray-faced and silent, still standing at the rail where he had been for hours. They also found 2 more cuts in the net. Ray did not tell them what he had seen. Not that morning, not for several days. He told himself that he needed time to process what had happened, to find words for something that defied description, to be certain that he had not hallucinated or dreamed or somehow misinterpreted what the spotlight had revealed. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. He was afraid they would not believe him. He was afraid he did not believe himself. The fishing continued, because fishing always continues, because the salmon were running and the season was short, and the mortgage payments did not care what Ray had seen in the darkness. But something had changed in the captain of the Bristol Maid. He became quiet, watchful, prone to standing at the rail and staring at the water as if waiting for something to emerge from it. He checked the nets with an intensity that bordered on obsession, examining each morning's cuts with the scrutiny of a crime scene investigator. He slept poorly when he slept at all. The cuts in the nets continued as well, appearing almost nightly now, always in the same section of mesh, always clean and precise. And on 2 more occasions over the following week, Ray kept the night watch and saw the disturbance moving along his cork line. He did not turn on the spotlight again. He could not say why, exactly, except that some part of him did not want to confirm what he already knew. Some part of him was not ready to face it again. But another part of him, the part that had survived 31 years on dangerous waters, the part that solved problems and found solutions and never gave up, was already forming a plan. On July 16th, Ray Novak made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He went to the harbormaster's office in Dillingham and tried to file a report. The office was a small wooden building near the docks, smelling of diesel and coffee, staffed by men who had known Ray Novak for decades. He told them about the net damage, about the pattern of cuts, about the losses to his catch. He showed them photographs of the incisions, laid out the data he had been collecting. And then, because he could not keep carrying this alone any longer, he told them what he had seen with his own eyes. The harbormaster, a man named Bill Torrance, whom Ray had known for 20 years, listened without interruption. His face was carefully neutral, but Ray could see something shifting behind his eyes, something that might have been concern or might have been embarrassment. When Ray finished speaking, Bill was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if Ray had been drinking. He had not. Bill asked if Ray had been sleeping properly. He had not, but that was beside the point. Bill suggested that perhaps the long hours and the stress of the season had led Ray to misinterpret what he had seen, that perhaps a seal or a sea lion in unusual lighting conditions had created an impression that his tired mind had filled in with details that were not really there. The mind played tricks, Bill said, especially at night, especially when you were tired, especially when you were looking for something and wanted to find it. Ray listened to these explanations, and he understood where they came from, and he understood that Bill Torrance was trying to help him, trying to give him an out, trying to let him walk back a story that was going to make him a laughingstock if it spread through the fleet. But Ray had seen what he had seen. He left the office without another word. He had expected this response, on some level. He had known that what he was describing sounded impossible, sounded like the ramblings of a man who had spent too many nights alone on dark water. But he had hoped, perhaps naively, that his 3 decades of steady service, his reputation as a sober and reliable skipper, would count for something. They did not. Over the next several days, word spread through the Dillingham fleet that Ray Novak had gone to the harbor master's office and claimed to have seen a mermaid cutting his nets. The laughter was not cruel, exactly, but it was persistent. Other skippers would hail him on the VHF with joking requests to say hello to the mermaids for them. Someone left a plastic toy mermaid on the Bristol Maid's rail as a prank. The local bar in Dillingham, where fishermen gathered in the evenings, grew quiet when Ray walked in and erupted in whispers when he left. Ray endured all of this in silence, because there was nothing else he could do. But on the last night of the season, as the Bristol Maid made her final run back to port with holds full of salmon, he made another decision. He told Mike and Danny everything. They sat in the wheelhouse as the lights of Dillingham grew larger on the horizon, and Ray described what he had seen in the spotlight beam. He described the pale skin and the dark hair. He described the eyes that reflected nothing. He described the teeth. He described the tail. And he described the way the creature had looked at him and returned to its work. The complete absence of fear that was somehow more disturbing than any aggression could have been. Mike and Danny listened, and unlike Bill Torrance, they did not immediately suggest that he had imagined it. Mike had been fishing these waters almost as long as Ray, and he had seen things over the years that he could not explain, things he had never spoken about to anyone outside the fleet. Danny, for his part, had the open mind of youth, the willingness to consider possibilities that older men dismissed out of hand. Neither of them said they believed Ray, but neither did they say they did not. And when Ray told them his plan for the next season, they did not try to talk him out of it. He was going to install cameras. He was going to prove what he had seen. The winter of 2002-2003 was consumed by preparation. Ray spent hours researching underwater camera systems, comparing specifications, consulting with technicians who specialized in marine filming equipment. He needed cameras that could operate in the cold waters of Bristol Bay, that could record in total darkness with infrared illumination, that could be mounted on a moving net without being destroyed by the forces involved. He needed waterproof housings rated for the depths and temperatures he would encounter. He needed a recording system that could capture hours of footage without attention. He needed cables that would withstand the stress of a working purse seine. The cost was staggering. By the time he had assembled everything he needed, Ray had spent nearly $40,000, most of it drawn from savings he had intended for retirement, money that Carol had counted on for their later years. His wife watched the boxes arrive, the cameras and housings and cables and recording equipment, and said nothing, though Ray could see the worry in her eyes, could feel the questions she was too kind to ask. Was he losing his mind? Was he chasing a phantom that would destroy them both? His children, grown now with families of their own, expressed concern in phone calls from Anchorage and Seattle. But Ray Novak had seen what he had seen, and he was done trying to convince anyone with words alone. He would capture proof. He would show them what was out there in the darkness. He would force them to believe. The 2003 season began on June 23rd, and the cameras went into the water on the first night. Ray had spent weeks perfecting the installation, working with Mike and Danny to mount 3 camera units in the belly of the net, positioned to cover overlapping fields of view. The cameras were connected to a recording system in the Bristol Maid's wheelhouse by cables that ran up through the mesh, carefully routed to avoid interference with the fishing operation. Infrared lights, invisible to the human eye, but bright as day to the cameras, illuminated the underwater scene. For the first week, the cameras captured nothing unusual. Fish entering the net, their silver bodies flashing in the infrared light. The occasional seal investigating the mesh, pressing its nose against the monofilament before swimming away. The murky shapes of jellyfish drifting through the illumination like ghosts. The nets were not cut. Ray began to wonder if whatever had been visiting his sets had moved on, had found easier hunting grounds, had for some reason chosen to leave the Bristol Maid alone. Perhaps it had been a single creature, a lone individual that had since died or migrated to other waters. Perhaps his presence during those night watches had scared it off for good. Perhaps, and this was the thought that gnawed at him in the small hours, perhaps he had imagined the whole thing after all. And then, on the night of July 3rd, exactly 1 year after the first cuts had appeared, the cameras captured something. Ray was in the wheelhouse, monitoring the live feed on a small screen he had installed beside the helm, when the image changed. At first, he thought it was a malfunction, some kind of interference that was causing the picture to blur and shift. But then the blur resolved into a shape, and the shape moved closer to the camera, and Ray Novak found himself looking at a face. It was not the same face he had seen the previous year. This one was different, the features arranged slightly differently, the pattern of scales on what might have been its cheeks forming a distinct configuration. But it was the same kind of creature, the same pale gray-white skin and dark tangled hair, the same oil-black eyes that reflected no light, even from the infrared illumination. It was examining the camera. For several long seconds, it peered into the lens with what might have been curiosity, tilting its head at different angles, reaching out with one webbed, clawed hand to touch the housing. Its face filled the screen, every terrible detail visible in the infrared light, the needle teeth, the scales that ran along its jaw and down its neck, the nostrils that were barely more than slits, the complete absence of anything resembling human warmth or emotion in those black eyes. And then it moved away, and Ray saw that it was not alone. There were 3 of them, 3 creatures, pale and monstrous and wrong, moving through the belly of his net with a coordination that spoke of practice, of routine, of intelligence. They were working together. One would position itself at a section of mesh and hold the netting taut, pulling it flat so that the weave was clearly visible. Another would move in with something sharp in its hand, a claw, or a piece of shell, or some tool that Ray could not identify, and make a careful incision, cutting through the monofilament with surgical precision. The third would position itself below the cut, gathering the salmon that spilled through the opening, disappearing below the frame of the camera to deposit them somewhere Ray could not see. Then they would move to the next section, and the process would repeat. They were harvesting his catch, systematically, efficiently, with a method that suggested long practice and careful planning, as if this was not the first net they had worked, not the first season they had done this, but something they had been perfecting for longer than Ray could comprehend. And they showed no concern whatsoever for the cameras that were watching them. They did not try to avoid the lenses. They did not shield their faces or turn away from the infrared lights. One of the creatures passed directly in front of the lens, close enough that Ray could see the individual scales on its tail, the way the fins at the end were ragged and torn as if from long use. Another glanced at the camera, the same assessing look that Ray had seen on the deck of the Bristol Maid a year ago, and then returned to its work without any sign of alarm. They knew the cameras were there. They did not care. The footage continued for 17 minutes before the creatures finished their work and departed. Ray watched every second of it, his hands gripping the console, his breath coming fast and shallow. He had proof now Undeniable, recorded proof of something that should not exist, something that the scientific community insisted could not exist, something that the harbor master had dismissed as a hallucination. He had caught it on camera. 3 separate angles, 17 minutes of continuous footage, showing creatures that looked like nothing documented in any scientific text. This was the evidence he had spent $40,000 and a year of ridicule to obtain. This would change everything. But what happened next is where the story becomes complicated, where the simple narrative of discovery and vindication falls apart into something messier and more disturbing. Ray Novak showed the footage to Mike and Danny, who watched in silence and then sat for a long time without speaking. When Danny finally spoke, his voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "What do we do with this?" he asked. It was a question Ray had not fully considered. He had been so focused on capturing the evidence, on proving what he had seen, that he had not thought through what would happen after. He showed the footage to his wife, Carol, who wept and asked him what he was going to do. She asked him if he understood what this would mean, if he understood that no one would believe him, if he understood that trying to show this to the world would destroy his life. He understood. He showed it anyway. He contacted the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, requesting a meeting to discuss a matter of urgent importance to the Bristol Bay fishery. A representative came to Dillingham, a young woman with a clipboard and a skeptical expression, and Ray showed her the footage on a laptop in his kitchen. She watched without comment, her face revealing nothing. When the footage ended, she asked if Ray had any corroborating evidence, any physical samples, any documentation beyond his own recordings. He did not. She asked if anyone else had witnessed these creatures. Ray said his crew had not seen them directly. She asked if Ray would be willing to submit the footage for analysis, to allow experts to examine it for signs of manipulation or fabrication. Ray said he would. She left, promising to follow up in a way that suggested she never would. And she never did. Ray reached out to a marine biologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, a man who had published papers on the undocumented species of the northern Pacific. The biologist agreed to examine the recordings, expressing polite interest in what Ray had described. A week passed with no response. 2 weeks. When Ray finally reached the biologist by phone, the man was apologetic but firm. The footage was interesting, he said, but without physical evidence, without multiple independent witnesses, without any way to verify the authenticity of the recordings, he could not stake his reputation on it. He wished Ray the best. He never called again. Ray tried to contact news organizations, first in Alaska and then nationally. He sent copies of the footage to local television stations, to national networks, to documentary producers who specialized in unexplained phenomena. The responses followed a pattern. Interest, followed by skepticism, followed by polite rejection. Too easy to fake, they said. No way to verify it, they said. They appreciated Ray sharing his experience with them, but they would not be pursuing the story. One producer, a woman who worked for a cable network that specialized in paranormal content, was more honest than the others. She called Ray personally, something none of the others had done, and she spoke to him for nearly an hour. She told him that she believed his footage was genuine. She told him that she had seen other evidence from other sources that suggested he was not alone in what he had witnessed. But she also told him that no mainstream outlet would touch this story. The footage was too strange, too threatening to too many assumptions about the world. It would be dismissed as a hoax, and anyone who reported on it seriously would be dismissed along with it. If Ray wanted to be taken seriously, he would need a body. He would need physical proof that could be examined, tested, verified by independent laboratories. He would need something that could not be explained away as camera tricks or tired eyes or the imagination of a man who had been on the water too long. Without that, his footage was nothing more than an expensive curiosity. By the end of 2003, Ray Novak had spent nearly $50,000 on camera equipment and investigation. He had sent copies of his footage to more than 30 different organizations. He had endured the renewed mockery of his colleagues, the worried silences of his family, the growing conviction that he had wasted the best years of his savings on a quest that could never succeed. His reputation in the Dillingham fleet, built over 3 decades of reliable service, had been replaced by a new identity. He was the Mermaid guy now, the crazy one, the skipper who had finally been out on the water too long. Men who had trusted him with their lives, who had borrowed money from him and lent him their expertise, who had fished beside him through storms and accidents and tragedies, now avoided his eyes when they passed on the docks. Conversations stopped when he approached. Invitations to the evening gatherings at the harbor bar ceased arriving. His Christmas card list grew shorter each year. It was not cruelty, exactly. It was fear. The fleet had spent generations building a wall between themselves and the things they sometimes glimpsed in dark water, and Ray Novak had tried to tear that wall down. They could not forgive him for it. Ray kept fishing because he had to, because it was all he knew, because Carol needed him to keep earning and the bills would not pay themselves. But he stopped talking about what he had seen and what he had filmed. He stopped trying to convince anyone. The cameras came down. The footage went into storage, carefully preserved but never shown. And for nearly 20 years, Ray Novak kept his silence. He fished the Bristol Bay salmon runs every summer, watching the water with eyes that saw more than anyone knew. He noticed patterns in the net damage that other skippers reported, incisions that matched the ones he had documented years before. He heard whispers from old-timers, stories told late at night in bars after too many drinks, stories that sounded like his own and stopped abruptly when anyone asked for details. He came to understand that he was not alone in what he had witnessed, that other men had seen things in these waters that they would never report, that there was a conspiracy of silence among the fleet, unspoken but absolute. And he came to understand something else as well. Whatever was out there in the darkness had been there for a very long time, long before Ray Novak arrived, long before his father or grandfather had fished these waters. Perhaps as long as the salmon had been running, perhaps longer. They were not invaders or newcomers, or some previously undiscovered species that had wandered into familiar waters. They were the ones who had always been here. The fishermen were the invaders. And the creatures had simply adapted, had learned to harvest from the nets the way they had once harvested from the open water, had incorporated the human presence into their routine without ever acknowledging it as a threat. That was what disturbed Ray most of all, in the end. Not the teeth, not the eyes, not the alien wrongness of bodies that should not exist. It was the indifference. The way they had looked at him and his cameras and his million-candle power spotlight and simply continued their work. They did not fear him. They did not respect him. They did not even hate him. They simply did not care. He was irrelevant. A nuisance at most, like a seagull hovering around a fishing boat, something to be ignored while the real work continued. Ray Novak is 76 years old now, and he has decided that the world should see what he captured. The footage sits in a fireproof safe in his home in Dillingham. 47 minutes of digital video recorded over 4 nights in July 2003, showing creatures that should not be real doing things that suggest intelligence, organization, and a complete lack of fear regarding human observation. He no longer cares if people believe him. He no longer cares if they call him crazy. He has lived with this knowledge for more than 2 decades, and he has made his peace with it, and he has decided that the judgment of others matters less than the truth. He has made the footage available. He has told his story one more time, and he has left the verdict to those who watch and listen. Was it a hoax? Was it the most elaborate practical joke in the history of Alaskan fishing, perpetrated by a man who spent $50,000 and destroyed his own reputation for no reason anyone has ever been able to explain? Or was it something else? something that fishermen have whispered about for generations, something that the authorities dismiss and the scientists ignore, and the rest of us tell ourselves cannot possibly be real. The waters of Bristol Bay hold millions of sockeye salmon each summer, and they hold mysteries as well. Mysteries that swim beneath the surface, that surface only in the darkness, that watch the human boats pass overhead with eyes that reflect no light. Ray Novak knows what he saw in the spotlight beam on that night in 2002, knows what his cameras captured in 2003, and he knows that whatever is down there in the darkness, whatever has been harvesting from those waters for longer than anyone can guess, it is not afraid of us. It looked at him and went back to work. It saw the cameras and did not care. It has been operating in those waters, perhaps for centuries, and it has no intention of stopping. What Ray Novak captured on those July nights may have been the greatest hoax ever perpetrated by a struggling fisherman, or it may have been the most important footage of the century. You will have to decide for yourself. But the next time you eat wild Alaskan salmon, caught in the cold waters of Bristol Bay, perhaps you will wonder about the hands that touched those nets in the darkness. Perhaps you will wonder what else is out there, beyond the reach of our lights, going about its ancient business while we convince ourselves that we understand the world. Perhaps you will wonder if Ray Novak was telling the truth. And perhaps, like Ray himself, you will find that the answer matters less than the question. Because in the end, whether the footage is real or fake, whether Ray Novak saw what he claims to have seen, there is something in his story that resonates with anyone who has ever looked out at dark water and felt that they were not alone. There is something in the way the creature looked at him, in that moment of eye contact that held neither fear nor aggression, but only a vast and terrible indifference. We want to believe we matter. We want to believe we are the masters of this world, the apex predators, the ones who decide what lives and dies in the waters we claim as our own. But what if we are wrong? What if there are things out there that have been watching us for centuries, things that have seen empires rise and fall, things that will be here long after our fishing fleets have rusted away to nothing? What if they look at us the way we look at insects? That is the question Ray Novak has lived with for more than 20 years. That is the question his footage forces us to ask. They are out there. They have always been out there, and they are not afraid of us at all. If you have had an experience on the water that you cannot explain, something you have kept to yourself because you knew no one would believe you, consider sharing it in the comments below. The community that has gathered around these accounts has heard many things that the rest of the world dismisses. You are not alone in what you have seen. And if these accounts interest you, if you want to hear more stories from those who have encountered the unexplained in our oceans and waterways, subscribe to Maritime Incident Files for more accounts from the deep. The water holds more secrets than we know. And sometimes in the darkness, when the lights go out and the engines fall silent, those secrets look back at us with eyes that hold no fear, only patience, only time.